is attaching your own feeling of success to your children's behavior is just like a surefire way to have a terrible relationship with your kid and really just a disaster for you, because there is no child who's going to be perfect. And whether they're picky eaters or whether they're handsy or whether they're struggling at school or, just a litany of different things that naturally come up with a child who is growing and you're growing next to them.
Welcome back to the show. I am so excited about this week's guest. We have a friend, mother, author of The Power Pause, and founder of Mother Untitled, Neha Ruch, here with us this week. Neha, welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you here.
Oh, Katy, it's such a pleasure. And I'm just so glad to be in conversation and have sort of grown up with you for the last decade.
Yeah, we were just talking offline about how we've been following each other for like the past 6-7 years, and it feels surreal to finally be having this conversation. So I'm so happy to be doing this. Before we jump in, I just want to share with the audience a little bit about why I'm so drawn to your work and to what Mother Untitled stands for, because I think it's really relatable for a lot of women. I never really intended to be a stay-at-home mom. I worked in advertising for about a decade and then left advertising to go become a chef. And I was working in the culinary world when I got pregnant with my first son, and I was making minimum wage at the time. And the idea of affording childcare and paying someone to stay home with my son while I went back to work just didn't seem financially viable. And so I ended up being a stay-at-home mom, really unintentionally. I was this really ambitious girl who thought, I'm never going to be the person who stays home and bakes cookies and is on the PTA school board. Like, that's just not how I identified myself. And yet I found myself at home with this little baby baking cookies. And absolutely nothing wrong with it, just wasn't what I pictured and not how I identified myself. And as years went on, I had a few more kids and continued to stay home. And I tried to find different ways of finding my identity again. And I started blogging and started coming out of motherhood, the throes of motherhood, and tried finding my own creative outlets, but it was really hard because I wasn't getting paid for that work. And so I never quite identified with the stay-at-home mom, and I never quite identified with the working mom. I was somewhere in this gray area, and I'd look out in the world and I didn't really feel like I found my place in the world. And then I saw you sharing online. You're like, are you somewhere in the gray? We need to rebrand what the stay-at-home mom is. And it spoke so deeply to me because I was like, that's me. I'm not getting paid for my work right now, even though I still have all these ambitions and I'm still have this drive and this creative energy in me. And yet I still want to be home with my kids. So I just want to say personally, for all of the women out there who are in the gray, which I think is such a mass number, thank you for calling out that there is this need to change the narrative around what it means to be a stay-at-home mom. So first and foremost, thank you.
Well, that means the world. And it's so many more of us than ever before. And, I think it's stories like that and the women sort of I've met that just sort of let that spark and have kept it going for so long, because it is so dynamic and it is so different than sort of the black and white picture that just makes us feel so weird when we first sort of part with the identity we thought we were going to have. So thank you for saying that.
For those who don't know you, can we start at the beginning and can you share a little bit about your background, your story, and then what prompted you to start Mother Untitled?
Sure. And Katy, you prepped me about wanting to be really real. So I'm going to actually go a little bit further back than my usual. So I grew up outside of Boston. I immigrated here when I was 3 or 4. I'm from India, and I loved my town. Some of my closest girlfriends are still from there, but it was a very predominantly white town. And the reason that's relevant is because I spent quite a long time during those years really trying to fit. And then by the time I got to my career, it became sort of the way I was going to fit even more, right? By proving myself in that capacity. So I spent my 20s, like you, really clocking in. I mean, you remember it was like 80 or 90 hour weeks back then. And that was the badge of dinner was if you sort of
Yep.
kept a change of clothes in your
Yep.
desk drawers. Um, and it all felt fine. And and I went to business school almost as if to sort of get another mark next to my name to say, like, I'm here, I'm worthy. And it was really all sort of healing in a way until I had my first child. And I'd landed my dream job by this point. I was running brand at a tech company. I was married, and it was January of 2016, and I was sort of rocking in this white rocking chair. And you remember those days that are like you're in the middle, up in the middle of the night. I had very leaky boobs that were like spraying all over the place. None of it was like picture perfect, but I did for the first time, probably in my entire adult, and maybe even child life, I felt like I belonged because, with your child, your children, they only want you. You don't have to try to be something else. You don't have to try to climb a ladder. You don't have to prove your worth besides just loving them. And I think that was so freeing. And so it really came naturally to me to say I wanted that time, more time. And I initially downshifted my career, so I didn't fully pause. I transitioned to 2 days a week for lots of reasons, which we can get into. But it was amazing how very quickly I started hearing from really everyone that I respected, whether they were friends from business school, friends from college, in-laws, extended family, my own parents. Even my husband was worried I was going to get bored. And it really did come from a good place. It was, are you going to get bored? Are you giving up in some way? Are you ever going to be able to go back? Are you giving up on feminism and the sort of, all of the sort of implications? And yet none of it really matched how I was feeling. I felt very at peace with my decision. I felt very confident that, there was something that I felt sort of a clarity of self and a freedom. And maybe it was just this sort of inherent self-trust. And I am sort of
Yeah.
naturally a risk taker, but, I felt this trust that I was a creative,
Yep.
interesting, intelligent person who
Yeah.
was only going to get more open-minded during this time at home. And I was meeting all these incredible women like you who,
Yeah.
similar to myself, across different industries, really were making similar choices. I was meeting them on the playground. I was meeting them in this like baby movement class we would do in the like sort of linoleum floor of the
Yeah. Yeah.
floor of Babies R Us. Like it was, and maybe it looked on the outside like we were mom buns and athleisure, but it really felt like these soulful, interesting, ambitious conversations, and none of it matched the stereotype.
Yes.
And like I said, this was 2016, so it was the height of the Lean In movement, the height of the girl boss era. And so I started to noodle on this idea of, well, what would it look like to create a new narrative
Yeah.
that you're speaking about for all of these women who self-identify with ambition, have clocked in a lot of their career, but are sort of trusting themselves to take this chapter focused on family life and really are excited about it and happy about it and have equitable relationships with their partner, but still are feeling a lot of shame. So I started Mother Untitled as really a blog and an Instagram, and I totally paused my career at that time. So there was a great irony in sort of building it during naps and night times. And that was now almost 7.5 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's grown, and I've collected incredible women in this collective. And it really is, I'm lucky. I love words. So I've been able to sort of speak to the experience and share that. But it's really the women in the community who have sort of collectively reshaped that sort of one-dimensional view we had on motherhood.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I love you sharing that. And I think it's so relatable for so many women. We have this outside drive to prove and to be successful. And especially at that time in the world, to be a successful woman meant like you were going to collect the degrees, you were going to, move up the ranks in your career. And I definitely felt that pressure. It was like we wanted to prove, it was like our parents had worked so hard and the feminist movement worked so hard, like we weren't going to let them down. We were going to, it was like I almost felt, and I don't know if you relate to this, like I owed it to the women before me. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do this. I have the opportunity, of course. But I think that you're right in that motherhood, when for some of it's not motherhood, for some it's, something outside of ourselves, but there's this moment where you feel this sense of coming home to yourself, whether it is like for you, it was rocking Bodhi in that chair, where you have this moment where you're like, wait a second, I am so much more than all of these outside things. Knowing that, how can I reshape something that works for me, that allows me to keep this connection to self, to know that my identity is not tied to a career, and still be able to have some creative outlets to challenge myself and do all of these things. And I we think so many women can relate to your story. Did you know when you were starting Mother Untied, like when you first started that Instagram page and you first started that website, did you know what you were building at the time? Like, was the vision fully formed?
The mission was fully formed. So I actually
Yeah.
went back to read. I remember it was January 10th. Bodhi had just turned 9 days before. He's a New Year's baby. And I sent an email to sort of 450 people
Yep.
who I had known and had sort of accumulated in my circles through my career and professional
Yeah.
life, right? And these are people I admired. And I wrote this letter via, a newsletter via MailChimp. And I described
Yep.
what I
Yep.
wanted. MailChimp, you remember, and I described what I wanted to do. And it was the exact
Yeah.
same mission that I am speaking
Yeah.
about. But I talked about it. I said, you know, I know what everyone thinks of mom blogs. Like I'm
Yeah.
fully aware that,
Yeah.
this is like a little blog or a little, but this is a big movement and a big
Yeah.
white space, and I'm excited about it. And I remember being so nervous when I sent it because
Yeah.
I could feel sort of the people rolling their eyes a
Of
little
course.
bit,
Yes.
Um, and yet then I got just such wonderful, however many people rolled their eyes, I got so many wonderful responses of women, especially saying, I know someone who is like what you described, right? Because I said at the time, I said it's ambitious women leaning into family life, pursuing creative and personal growth alongside. And so people started saying, and that's really how it grew. I started just sharing, spotlighting, and Katie, you were among one of the first women, at least the first 1 year of women I found who sort of represented that new narrative, right? A woman who had accumulated 10 years in their career or more, who had a really loving, equitable relationship with their partner, who had access to tools like I did on whether it was Instagram or there was a real life community where they were sort of pursuing that exploration. And so I would just shine a light every week on different women who sort of comprised of this new gray area, this sort of vast in between of the black and white ideas of stay at home and working.
Yeah. I love that you had this vision in your head. And even though it wasn't this like beautiful website that it is now, that you just started like, I'm going to send an email out to 400 some people that I know personally. And I know people are going to roll their eyes and have opinions. And I just want everyone who's listening right now to understand, like, that's where you begin. You begin scared with a little nugget of idea and you work with what you have and you send it out and you say, I don't care what, I know people are going to have opinions and think things, but I believe in this enough to know that this is going to become something big. So I give you so much credit because I know what a big leap of faith that is. And to be able to tune out like other people's judgment or like, I don't know this is going to succeed. I mean, there was no way at that time 7 years ago you knew that this was going to take off and you just do it blindly anyway. And I give you so much credit. That's a really hard thing to do.
You know what I did know was that I was getting to do something that I hadn't given myself permission to do in my paid work
Yeah.
life, right?
Yeah.
Like I'd
Yeah.
always loved content. Like I loved Pinterest before it was even Pinterest, right? Like I would rip pictures. I like keep the magazine industry alive by like all my subscriptions still. And I think I, I do this exercise and we've talked about this before of sort of figuring out what your success metrics are. And really, even with the personal projects, even with the hobbies, and mine really was getting to meet other women and getting to learn. And I think that sort of, and if I sort of had impact, that was sort of number three. Like I didn't know how much it would grow or not grow, but I did get to play again. And, when you check your ego in such a big way, I'd already checked my ego. I had to tell everyone I was a stay-at-home mom. I'd already dealt with everyone rolling their eyes at me. So at that point, it was almost freeing of like, you want to call it a little Instagram or a little blog. I will not pretend that that didn't hurt at times, because I do think worrying about what people think is a very hard thing to shake. It was probably the biggest work
Yes.
I did
Yeah.
in this stage of life. It was definitely the sort of deepest work. And a lot of my sort of time at home was spent on a lot of that personal work. And, I always talk about the book Four Agreements.
Oh, yeah.
Is because I think really unpacking when people critique how little that
Yeah.
has to do with you,
Yeah. Yeah.
was actually one of the gifts from this stage of life. Because in letting
Yeah.
myself make these bold decisions, I think it sort of equipped me to be able to do that more now, even when my kids age into school and I sort of have more time
Yeah.
available for work.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think that's so relatable for how so many women feel as they're trying to like find what their voice is or find them, what the next opportunity is. And I think the fact that you had that connection to self and it was like sitting with Bodhi, you're like, okay, this is actually who I am. It empowers you then to go believe in yourself and be like, you know what, I am going to put myself out there. I'm going to try something new. So thank you for sharing that. I don't want to switch gears too much, but I want to talk about going back to just sort of like the mission of Mother Untitled. Can we talk about the language around the term stay at home mom? I feel like I've heard you speak about this before and it's always kind of bothered me. I'm like, can we not update this? And I've thought about it so much. And I saw you share something on Instagram and I don't remember the exact quote, but it was something around this idea of, we've progressed so much for women in the workforce, and yet we've left the stay-at-home mom behind. And I really do feel that way. Can you talk about just like the language around the stay-at-home mom and your thoughts on either giving it a rebrand or how we can reframe that?
It's so interesting because at one point I did poll our audience, not just once, but three different times sort of over the last 3 years. And it's come back sort of consistently with the same. I've asked, would you rather have a new name for stay at home mom? Would you rather just infuse more dignity and respect into stay at home mom? Right. So you say
That
that.
would that
And
would be good.
or
Yep.
would you like to do both?
Yeah.
Universally, it was like, let's do both. Because the phrase, it's funny because the phrase actually wasn't introduced into mainstream media until the 90s.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah, it was a New York Times article. But it's interesting because the stay at home mom phrase goes back to a Jane Austen
Hmm.
book. Right.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
so you can sort of date it back, and it was like really to imply like a hermit. So,
Hmm.
it's like very original sense. And so, and just from like there's a sociolinguist, Ben Zimmer, who
Hmm.
looked at the phrase. And if you compare it to working mom, right,
Yeah.
stay at home is not a verb. So
Yeah.
working implies forward moving,
Yes.
implies productivity. Stay at home implies shut in and stagnant. So
Yes.
just from pure linguistics, it's a flawed phrase, right? So like,
Hmm.
and we could sort of, um, you can really toy with what sort of alternatives are. I've seen and used at home parent, so that
Hmm.
you can take away, it's less gendered. You take away the stagnancy of stay. I've used lead parent. And there's also this inverse, which is I think we don't necessarily need, and I talk about this in the first chapter of the book, in the script of how do you answer, what do you do? There's also a world we don't need to respond with like one pithy phrase. We can say, right now, I'm mostly with my kids and I'm working on a nutrition business. Something that gives you a little bit more fluidity, because I think that's where the trap is. Our culture loves little boxes to put people in, right? Yet and that's what's created this sort of fear of parting with the one track trajectory. But when we kind of can accept that we're not on just one trajectory, where actually our career can take sort of many pauses and shifts and each experience is a layer, then it just gives us all we all sort of can exhale a bit. So that's my hope, is actually to part with sort of this pithy title at all and just be able to say, like, right now I get to, or right now I am. Uh, and then on the other side, also sort of this larger cultural kind of dialogue around how can we sort of infuse more dignity and respect into this chapter spent on caregiving, right? Because I think that's a lot of the work too. It's certainly
Yeah.
one part to sort of reshape the language and give words, but another part is fundamentally to say this time at home does not look like what it did in the 1970s, right?
Right.
Where women are bringing in a lot more education and experience into motherhood because we're having kids later. We have access to so many more tools and technologies that let us experiment and explore. There's such a larger freelancing creator and entrepreneurial economy that lets us also stay involved in new ways. And it's just, to your point around that post that I often share about, the sort of working mother archetype having moved forward so much, in
Yeah.
the 70s, 1980s, 1990s. We have all these models, but then we've been left with this decades old character of June Cleaver, right? And there's all
Yes.
sorts of reasons why that is. It's like the advent of television with the second wave of feminism, that you can get into the history of it, but the net of it is that it's contributed to this like huge power chasm. And now it's on us to sort of update the perception, because I do think, call it what you want, but a chapter spent at home can be incredibly purposeful, creative, interesting, can open up new personal growth, right? Like I grew more as a human being in those years than ever before, right? Both in my perspective as well as sort of my soft skills. And it can reshape your perspective and passion about what comes next. So it's a very fluid answer.
I love that so much. And, I think I hope we get to the time, the day and age where we stop even asking the question, what do you do? And instead we can ask the question of like, what is inspiring you right now? Where are you spending your time? What are you passionate about right now? And that could easily be, I'm about helping my children transition into high school or whatever it may be for a person who isn't necessarily being paid for work, that you have answers, because that question in itself feels so limiting to even define who someone is. So getting to a point where like we no longer need these black and white answers would be a wonderful place for our children to grow up and for
Yes.
us
And if
to
I were to
live.
say one thing that I really don't want to hear women say is I'm just a mom. Because I
Oh,
feel like I've heard it a million times. I'm just a mom right now. Like,
yeah.
you're not just a mom. You're
Yeah.
never just, and I
Yeah.
think, and it's not on women. That's how they've been made to feel, that is sort of
It's
somehow inferior as a
yes.
role and as a output, and, in a culture that puts so much stock in what we do for pay.
Yeah.
We've sort of, and I do think it's shifting. Like, I mean, I'm sure we're going to talk about sort of both of our journeys in entrepreneurship, but I do think that right now versus when I started, there's
Yeah.
much more of an appetite for this discussion around
Yes.
re-examining our relationship to ambition and paid work.
Yeah. I would love to talk a little bit about the Mother Untitled study that you did. Remind me the name of the study.
So we commissioned a survey called American Mothers on Pause,
Yep.
and we did that with a firm based in Maryland called Proof Insight. So they fielded it across 1,200 stay-at-home moms and 1,000 members of the general population. And the reason I did it was because if you looked at the research, every year we see a working mother report, but we've sort of counted out and left out any women who identify with sort of downshifted or paused careers. And that's a really important and valid part of the family work equation. Like whenever we talk about, there's so much wonderful dialogue around all the things we need to do to support working women, quote unquote, but we never talk about returnships or, sabbaticals. There's sort of this like unspoken dialogue about how do we support the women on career pauses.
Well, I was looking at just some of the metrics of coming out of that study, and I mean, Neha, I was blown away by so many of the answers. I shouldn't say it didn't necessarily surprise me because I related to all of those. I was like, yep, I felt that way. I understood why they're responding this way. I think one of the biggest surprises for me is if we could talk for a moment about, well, I thought it was fascinating how it was almost like 70% of women feel like they're misunderstood, or that what they do at home, how they're spending their time, is either unseen or misunderstood, which we know that there's that invisible load that mothers carry that is hard to put either a label on or to express. And so, of course, you feel so misunderstood by society, by your partner, by your children. But then on top of that, the thing that really like was eye opening for me, and I'm so fascinated about, really because I dive so deeply into the well-being of women, is this understanding of, for stay-at-home mothers, that a metric of success for their own physical health was only 4% of women, which means that these mothers, and I think it was something in the 20s for their mental health, and which says to me that these mothers are, in their mind, I don't know if it's not necessarily worthy of their time and their energy, that they don't have the time and the energy, that the capacity isn't there, the resources aren't there, but that these women are not being cared for, are not being, that they're being seen, which we know that as soon as you feel unseen, you feel like, of course, my mental health isn't worth anything. I'm not even, what value am I adding? And it was really, I don't want to say the word like a scary number, but I thought about that. Like, that's what our children being raised in this environment where women don't feel like they can even take care of their mental and physical health. Can you speak to a little bit maybe about like some of the narratives you're hearing, or expand on what you're seeing as far as like women feeling in this stage that they have the either capacity or the resources to care for themselves, whether it's physical health or mental health?
I really sat with that piece of data as well for a long time because it is so shocking. So the sort of other talking point around that is that
Yeah.
that 4% who is tied with the number who reported a clean home. So physical health is tied with cleanliness of a house, right? Which obviously, like on paper, makes no sense. It's bananas. We can't
Yeah.
raise physically well children if we are not physically well,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And yet, if you got to this part of the research on the relationship to help and
Yep.
support,
Yep.
the part that still I was A, not shocked by, but B, was so hard to read was that almost 30%, so 1 in 3, had never had any help,
Yeah.
including
Yeah.
family. Like
Yep.
paid, unpaid, just were completely working around the clock 24/7. And I think a lot of it is tied to when women step away from working for pay, they quickly feel like then they have to do sort of everything in the home. And everything by themselves. So if we look just at the success metrics part, what quickly happens is it's not that they're consciously saying, I don't want to be physically and mentally well. It's that they're saying, well, if I'm, now that my entire output is related to the home and my kids, then I'm going to say that, okay, my worth and my work is measured by my children's behavior, my children's health, my children's happiness, my marriage, the stress in our home. And obviously, all of that is what happens is if we are attaching, and I'll speak to myself, my own experience, right? I remember when Bodhi was about 2 years and 9 months, I'd had Lila. Now, 2 years and 9 months with a boy is like notoriously hard, but no one had told me that. And then he got a little sister. And so we would go to the playroom, and I'm sure he won't mind me sharing this, but he would, he would push, he would be a little
Yeah.
handsy
Yes.
with the boys and the other, especially with little kids who were like in his space or playing with his trucks. And I was probably dealing with a bit of postpartum anxiety from having a second child, a daughter, and B, mortified. I felt like I'd failed.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
there is no way if I was looking at someone who had a 2.5-year-old and they told me my son's pushing, I would look at them and be like, oh, you must be a failure of a mother. But that is
Right.
how I
Right.
felt because
Yes.
I didn't have there was no other grading system for my work, which is why, in the book that we'll get to talking about later, but it was really important to me in the section sort of about settling into to the chapter at home. We started with establishing goals for yourself,
Yep.
because attaching your own feeling of success to your children's behavior is just like a surefire way to have a terrible relationship with your kid and really just a disaster for you, because there is no child who's going to be perfect. And whether they're picky eaters or whether they're handsy or whether they're struggling at school or, just a litany of different things that naturally come up with a child who is growing and you're growing next to them. So that's number one, that I don't think women, it's a lack of understanding that their health and wellness is a priority. It's that it's what's in front of them, it's what's visible. So naturally, it's the thing that we want to attach to our reflection of ourselves in our work.
Oh, and I can relate to that so much. I mean, I've gone through that and I've had to, separate myself, especially as my children are getting older and moving into these teenage years. And we're starting to see different things happen that you recognize. Like it was, I don't want to say the word control, but it felt like when the kids were younger, you almost had some type of like, you have a little bit of like, this is right, this is wrong. And you can kind of maneuver them a little bit. And then when you get to the teenage years, it's all hands off and you're having to let them become their own individual people. And it is a very big awakening of who your child is, has nothing to do with who you are. You are both individual people, but that is a real reckoning moment and like having to face yourself in the mirror to be like, well, if she's over here, if my daughter is over here and I'm over here, then who am I if I'm not a reflection of this? And it's tough when you are a parent who isn't working for income. There isn't that metric then of like, did I do good today? Am I providing? What am I worth really? And so I can appreciate that the easiest thing to grab onto then, because it's what we see reflected every moment in our days, is our children. And it can be very easily become attached to that.
Until we sort of are challenged to think outside of that. And, one thing that I did, I remember I really focused at one point, especially that year. I remember I really decided that my mental health was going to become a priority, and
Yeah.
specifically reactivity would became a really big personal goal for me. It was,
Yeah.
an area that I really wanted to heal and to work on. And I think that was really helpful in sort of reorienting towards another thing that was related, right? Like I
Hmm.
wanted to make sure that I could show up as the parent that I wanted to be during trying
Yeah.
moments. So it was definitely related to parenthood, but it was more in my control and related to my own being, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then the relationship to help, I do think that's a direct through line to worthiness. I think the biggest, hear it across socioeconomic, I interviewed 100 women across the country. It was my favorite part of the book writing process, in different industries, in different geographies, in different religions and cultures, and universally, the block around getting help was so significant, right? And I think, um, and I will throw myself under the bus. I think there's this real hope that, okay, if I am now on pause and my contribution is my work with the child, I can't outsource it. Like, here, the reality, what we know, parenting is so complex, especially right now. It's intellectually complex, it's emotionally complex, family administration is complex, the keeping of the home is complex, the building of communities. There's so many advocacy in health and education settings. And so you do need support if it's available to you. And that starts with your partner, right? Like your partner, just because they're working for pay when they're home at the end of the day at 5 p.m., like, or whatever time they're home, if they're able, you're sharing in the load because both of you are responsible at that point. Your workday, quote unquote, is done. But some of that rewriting is really challenging for women. And it is because we have not established a value and an understanding, sort of the breadth of parenting right now.
Oh my gosh. Yes. I love hearing you talk about this. And the hot topic that I really was excited to talk to you about was of this idea of like equitable parenting, which I really, if we can just take a little bit of time to kind of delve into, because I think that that is, if we can even just like call to light some of the stuff that's still going on, that we are all, some of these biases that we're still all holding, we can make a big change. You know, I feel very fortunate to be in a dynamic where my partner sees parenting in a very similar way. It took us, 17 years to get to this point, but we are here. But it's funny, he showed me this thing on Instagram. It was just so random. I don't know what I'm sharing this with you, but this father taking the kids to the park. And then it was like a two screen, like a mother doing something and a father doing something. And the mother was coming home with a piece of pizza and it was like lazy mom. She didn't do anything. And the dad walks in with pizza. And they're like, fun dad, like the great thing. And a dad takes him to the park and it's like, what an amazing dad. And the mom doesn't. It's like, well, that's what she's supposed to do. And I looked at him, he sent it to me and he was like, how did this make you feel? And I was like, it's crazy because you're so wonderful and you don't make me feel this way. And yet that still lives within me. I still feel that way. And I consider myself a fairly conscious, aware woman. And it catches me all the time of these things that still live within me of like, he works for pay and has a big job. And I'm at home with the kids, still trying to get my business up and running. I should be manning more of these things. I should be taking care on these things. And it is a really hard shift to make, even though I believe in my self-worth. I know I'm worthy of it. Physically, just like making that change and handing things over is still something consciously I have to do, even when my ego or my mental voice is really loud, being like, don't do that to him. Don't put that on him. He doesn't have the time and energy to be like, no, it's fair. And about 2 years ago, as I was starting to try to get my business up and running a little bit more, I'd said to JP, I'm starting to like uptick a little bit. I need more help. I'd love for you. And this is new and I probably shouldn't even be sharing this, but I had said to him, like, I need you to mentally take two of the kids. I'm going to mentally take two and you mentally take two. That means I need you to like think ahead of time of like when dentist appointments need to happen, to notice who needs a new pair of shoes, like to be a noticer, to be a caretaker, to do the things that I would do, not parent like a dad, but like, I need you to parent as if you were the lead parent, like you've got them. And so that mentally I'm not laying in bed thinking about it. There's just so much energy spent on that that's not seen. And it was a huge eye opener for the two of us. And he, of course, like thankfully, like graciously took on the role. And it's been fluid for the two of us trying to figure out what that actually physically looks like. But just that having that conversation of, I need you to take this off of my plate because I can't get to where I want to go if I'm burdened down by all of this. But it is really hard. And there's a lot of shame and guilt on asking someone to do that.
The account you're talking about is Mary Catherine Starr, who did that side post in her feed. Is called Mom Life Comics. She actually has a book coming out next year too, so everyone should follow her uh, because she does that a lot. She shines a light sort of on that sort of what's the phrase I'm looking for, that mixed perception or the this bias we have. And I think it's really helpful, mostly because it's our own bias oftentimes, right? Like I'll give you sort of another perspective. So my husband went golfing today, and when a man goes golfing, we're like, oh, a business networking thing. When we see women leaving tennis, or when we see them leaving a yoga studio, or we see them leaving a lunch in the middle of the day, we're like, oh, leisure time. Like, wow, women who we judge women for having leisure time. We do not. And I think this idea of we both deserve, if you think of one of the big reframes I offer in the book and through this work, is this idea that whoever's working for pay, whoever's not working for pay, whoever's sort of existing in between, whatever the dynamic financially, you're making this choice together, ideally, right? You're making this plan together. And in making that plan, you're deciding that you are an interdependent organization, meaning the partner working out of the home is agreeing to rely on you to do a lot of that thinking and planning and home upkeep so that they can not have to think about it when they're at work. right? They're relying on you, and the household income is shared. You're relying in that way. But I think what that does is also reframes the idea then that whether you're asking for help from that partner and you're saying, okay, I really actually need, well, if we have this list, and Eve Rodsky's work around fair play has been so helpful in this, like breaking all the tasks, but like, if these are all the tasks, I can't do them all, even if I'm the one not going into work. Like, which are the ones that either play to your strengths, that are physically available to you, that you can do. I'll give you the example that when my husband was running his tech company in sort of those first 5 years of parenthood, it was just a really intense time for him. But he was in front of a computer much more than I was because I had two young kids. So he did all of the sort of form filling and doctor's, that was easier to him, right? So that he also did a lot of the food shopping on Instacart because he's more of like, he's just savvier on the food sense, suppose. And so I think the dialogue is about knowing that you are a team. It's not always going to be 50-50. It certainly wasn't for those 5 years, but it felt fair. And it does take checking in as the kids get older. There's different needs. As his job changed and he had more bandwidth and I was dialing up and wanting, like you described, to uptick my work, it was giving ourselves sort of that moment to sort of express our needs and wants, see where we could both make accommodations or, invest together out of that joint household income in paid childcare, whether that was, we had a babysitter 3 afternoons a week, but that decision was made together. Oftentimes when we invest in childcare, and I think this is one of the tropes that holds women back from doing this if they're at home, is, well, I don't have an income, so I can't pay for help. Well, the reality is, like, as we all know, when we invest in help in whatever capacity, whether that's a cleaning lady or a laundry service or a meal delivery service or a babysitter or whatever, that helps the whole household and organization function better, right? It reduces the load on the partner working out of the home. It increases the joy, it increases the calm. So that is an investment that comes out of the joint household organization's budget. And so, there's a lot in sort of establishing that sort of mindset going in that ends up coming up, whether or not it's when you're talking about help or when it's when one of you is changing, changing your rhythm with your hobbies or your interests or your project or your small business. It lets you have sort of a more collaborative dialogue.
Yeah, no, I love that reframe of like both of you are just as invested in the family's success. And that takes both of you participating in this, regardless of gender, regardless of pay structure, that both of you have to be invested in this. I would say for me, I think one of the other things that has been sort of eye-opening as I look at this equitability within a partnership, within whether it's a marriage or whatever it may be, in parenting is this idea of like, I do think that while, yes, it is like the women who are the stay-at-home parent, the primary parent, are getting the help and it's sort of us having to let go of some of this guilt. The other part that I don't think is talked about enough is that I do think that these other partners, whether it's the men or the primary caregiver, primary income winner, whatever I want to phrase it, I think that there's a missed opportunity when they aren't involved. And I think they're wanting to be. And I think they're sort of being left behind and that they're not being asked to be the noticers or the caretakers. And I think that's a real miss, especially for our boys who are watching, of like, yes, I look at John Paul and he's like, I wanted to be involved more in the home. I didn't know how to jump on that carousel that was moving so quickly. And you seem to be manning it all so well and holding it all so tightly because it was part of my identity, that enabling him to like come into it, like that was also beneficial for him as well. It wasn't just beneficial for me. There was a piece of that family life that he was also missing. And I think sometimes we don't acknowledge it. Like, I think the other parent and partner is also craving that. They just haven't experienced it yet and don't know how to get into the mix. And so I think it's actually helping both parents. It's just not, I don't think that the men or the primary care primary breadwinners are necessarily like asking for that yet because they don't know that they're missing it, if that makes any sense. And once they get in it, they're like, wow, this is so rewarding. This is so fulfilling and something that I don't have in my career. And I think they're hungry for it. So I think it's a really welcome thing.
A friend shared this anecdote. Her husband is a very, he's a chief psychiatrist at a hospital, and he was realizing he was getting a little burned out by coaching some of the junior, like the residents and the fellows. And so he had stopped doing it, but he was missing it. And he started coaching his son's soccer team. And it ended up giving him something that he was so fulfilled by. And I
Yeah.
think, we see it like from a data perspective, this generation of men are spending 3 times the amount of time with their kids than any generation prior. And
Yeah.
I think that's also important to call out because I don't think the tropes about dads help because
I
it's sort of,
agree.
I think men, like you and I both have very involved partners. And by the way, my daughter goes to my husband to do her ponytails because she says he does a better job, and
I
so,
love this. Yeah.
I do think it's on us to expect more. Like,
Yeah. Yes.
and a lot of that is personal, right? It depends on what you're sort of looking for in a partner. And so when I got married, I was fairly certain, and we didn't know sort of the dynamics, how we were going to shift in our careers or not. But I was fairly certain that this was a man who was very competent and very, loved family. Like that was a huge value for him. He was, and he used, I can see with him sort of the incredible value of modeling because his dad was incredibly involved and was the one who cooked and the one who took care of the kids. And so he naturally, I don't think it was ever a challenge in that way. I think the bigger challenge is it's two things. It's one, us letting them in. And then two, what's interesting, so I'll give you the example. He has a work partner, and the other day the work partner said to him, "Oh, can you come to this meeting? It's at 8 a.m. on Monday." And he was like, "No, I dropped my kids off at school." And it was just he was shocked that his work partner, who's about 15 years older than him, hadn't considered that. But of course, that gentleman had not considered that. That was sort of foreign to him. And so there's a little bit of our husbands too charting a new course for themselves, and dealing with sort of what they're operating within from a professional perspective.
I agree. And I could go on with this for forever. JP and I have had so many conversations about this. We had a work dinner that I won't get into a couple of years ago that was really eye opening for him when his boss had mentioned something about him never being, he better never be at the 3 p.m. school bus pickup, like as a kind of a joke in front of me. And we were both kind of like taken aback by the joke. And it wasn't, no harm was meant by it, but we both certainly, it stuck with us. And I said to him, I'm okay with it. I know that you will be there whenever you want to be there for the kids and we'll figure that out. I just said, I just feel bad for you that that's the narrative for men, that like, you're not supposed to be there, that you won't be successful at your job if you're picking up your kids. I was like, that needs to change for you too, because it doesn't help me and it doesn't help you. And so I think recognizing that changing some of this narrative is good for all of us. Collectively, it's good for our children. It's good for the whole home life. I think is really important. So thank you for sharing that. It was really helpful. Can we talk a little bit about the book?
Sure, I'd
Okay.
love to.
So for those of you who have not pre-ordered it yet, you go do it right now. As soon as you get off, finish listening to this, go pre-order it. And when you do, you can automatically download the first chapter. And I was telling Neha, I was reading it the other night and it just gave me chills. It's such a beautiful opening of the book and it makes me so excited to read the rest of it in January. But can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Sure. So I had wanted to write this forever, and I'm so glad that I got the opportunity to. It's a great reminder for anyone who's sort of in the midst of planting the seeds for the work that they're excited about and they have this sort of big dream. I remember looking around in 2017, 2018, 2019, just thinking like, oh, all these like companies with their missions about supporting women that have either more funds or more time, or, they're dedicated in a different way and they're just moving. And I wasn't able to at the time, but I was consistent. And then, post 2020, the world was re-examining work and family in a way that allowed me to sell this book. I don't think I would have gotten this book deal had I tried to present it any year prior, right? So I want to share that because timing is everything, and I think the world is ready for it. The book is really a first of its kind guide for women who are ambitious to step into a chapter of a career pause with a sense of confidence and clarity and be able to sort of walk through it and really make themselves a priority alongside, and then ultimately to use it to unlock the full possibility of what could come next and really use it to explore. So the first section of the book tackles some of the roadblocks in preparing. Identity is that first chapter. We've talked a lot about that. Financial dignity, resigning and keeping your network intact. And it goes through both sort of the philosophical side, but also just like real stories from real women on how they navigated it, expert advice, and really exercises to make it your own. And then the middle section was actually my favorite because it was really about thriving at home. And it starts with that piece about, creating your own goals for this time and designing your routines and rhythms alongside those goals and giving examples of that, and then permission to get help, how you would have those conversations, how you would get all the myriad of options that exist for you in that sort of broad umbrella of help. And then that last section is exciting because I think if you go in with a sense of possibility that this could actually let you explore, I think you can feel so much more optimistic. So there's a chapter on networking because some of the best networking I did really was in the stage. It was at the playgrounds or at the baby classes, like I talked about. This idea of letting yourself explore again.
Yes, just play.
And how you can find that hobby if nothing sparks, how you can tinker with it. And then finally, the last chapter is for those of women who do want to return, how to do it. From networking to putting together their resume to interviewing. And so it's really practical, but it was just such a, the goal is really to ring a cultural bell. And that's why the pre-orders are so important, because I do think if we can say this book is out there and it belongs on all those big shelves next to all the leadership books and all the workbooks and all the lean-ins, it sort of validates this idea of career pauses being just as powerful of a chapter.
Yeah, no, I love that. And we are going to sell the shit out of this. We're going to get it on that bestseller list and it will be so wildly successful. I just want to take a moment and just comment on something quickly because I think this conversation is so important. I think a lot of women who are listening right now are in this, middle age as well. And I think sometimes when you hear the idea of like pausing for family life or pausing to be at home with your children, it can be really easy to think that it's for young moms, and these like newborn babies. And it's interesting because, I have a spectrum of kids ages, and my oldest in high school, and then we've got a middle schooler, and then these elementary age schools and kids. And while being a stay-at-home mom, primary caregiver at home looked like something when they were younger. It's interesting as my career is starting to a little uptick right now. I almost actually, Neha, feel a stronger pull to be at home as the kids are older because they need me in different ways and I mentally have to be more present. It is a much different load. When they were younger, it was a little bit more hands-on, and now as they're older, I feel that my energy, like they know when I'm thinking about other things, they pick it up and then they shut down or they don't talk to, and there's so many nuances with this teenage years, like needing to be on. Can you speak for a little bit about the women that you're seeing on pause? Like I just want to make this clear for anyone who's listening. Like this isn't just for people who are having newborns at home. This is for any woman who is a mother or taking a pause at any stage of that relationship with their children.
It's so interesting you said that. One of the biggest tropes is that it happened, like most people pause on maternity leave.
Yeah.
The reality is it's oftentimes at like big transition points. So
okay.
When people add another child oftentimes. So because they're like, oh my God, the logistics just got nutty or the cost of child just got crazy. Or you see a big uptick around the tween years because I think.
Okay. I could see that.
So that is really common. College applications. So I think the tween years have just, one of the things about parenting that has changed so much is the emotional demands, right? And the intellectual demands and how much achievement culture there is, but also how much mental health
Mm-hmm.
issues are cropping up. And so the a lot of women don't pause just for the sheer time, me included. It's really for the headspace. And so the book,
Yes.
and I think work in current American culture, it's very hard to compartmentalize. And so we see a lot of women pausing or finding work that works not only for time needs, but really to give them less stress. And so it's interesting when women, one of the data points from the survey is, how does a pause shape your desire for your career as you transition back? And it's so interesting. People will put more flexibility and less stress above above salary, right? So it's really interesting. I think the book is for anyone who is considering a pause, in it still, and making sense of it, and and those who are thinking about a return and thinking about how to put their story together. But I would say, these days a pause, it also includes the women who are just downshifting for a period, right? And they're rethinking, well, if I take this job that's not as senior, or if I downshift my hours, how do I still set myself up to thrive? How do I still think about myself as ambitious? Oftentimes it comes with a recalibration around household income. How do I navigate that? So, it is such a broad spectrum right now.
Thank you for sharing that and sort of making it feel more inclusive to all the women out there who are saying, like, I want to be ambitious and yet my kids are older, whatever it may look like, of just, it is a lot to manage all of the different moving parts. And so it's multifaceted, the times and the reasons people would need to say, hey, this is no longer working for me. I need to reevaluate and make some changes. So thank you for clarifying that and just making it feel really inclusive to all women. Can we talk a little bit about you making an uptick now in your own world and your career? You were on a pause or downshift for many years as you were building Mother Untitled, and here you are now, like in the throes of things and having so much wild success. And this book is, so many people are just so eagerly anticipating it and waiting it. How does it feel now to be like jumping back into things?
It's bizarre. I do find it, but it's bizarre. Mostly in that sometimes when I leave the kids and I'm like walking to work on this, the idea of dedicated time and space to work on something, it just felt so out of reach for so many
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
I just couldn't have imagined it. And by the way, if my kid's sick, or like the after school babysitter is, in Nashville with her mom, as she is right now, like I'm leaving here to pick up my kids. So, but I think one of the things that is helping, because I will tell you, sometimes it makes me feel a lot of times I'm a little bit in awe of it, that like, well, time did pass, it did all, lead me here. And, there were just so many years that this just seemed so unfathomable. But like, somehow we're here. Um, I will tell you that I do sometimes feel sad about it, because I do think that some of the headspace that I so loved for sort of personal growth,
Yeah.
around reactivity, like we talked about, I feel like that's a little bit harder to prioritize, and something has to
Yeah.
give at any given time. So I'm still working through that, and everything takes sort of a re-examination. I'm definitely having more conversations with my husband about, okay, well, I know that I was always sort of default on the kids if like school was closed, but like, how can we renegotiate that, especially this
Yeah.
year? Sometimes I feel a little bit like I miss pickups. I've
Yeah.
sort of committed to this idea of, I take them to school, we have a babysitter, do pickups, or they have after school till 5, and basically we all reconvene at around 4:30. And that's still amazing. We still get a lot of time together, and it's focus time. But there's times I just feel nostalgic about
Yes, of
those just sort
course.
of leisurely afternoons together. Um, But the thing that is getting me sort of that gets me through that is this idea that actually, like I talk a lot about in the context for women on career pauses or downshifts, which is that like this is for right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
We get to re-examine and it'll shift again. I
Yes.
really have no doubts. It's already on my calendar that like March is pretty much a full pause again.
I
You know,
love
I'm
that.
going
Good for
to give
you.
this book everything I possibly can. I think it's so important that it gets the sort of cultural reception that it deserves. I want to see it through. And then I do want to sort of take a beat, be with my family, re-examine. And I think that is how that helps, is just sort of giving myself, and I say it to women, like I said, on pauses, which is like, it's not forever. So give yourself, like, put time on the calendar. It doesn't have to be a month, but to re-examine and recalibrate whether that would be with your partner or yourself.
Yeah, I love that. Good for you. I'm so happy for you. If you could give someone listening right now one piece of advice who find a woman who finds herself in the gray area, whether she's downshifting or upshifted, but she finds herself in that gray area, as you look back maybe on your own journey of being in the gray and coming out of it now, is there one piece of advice or like one little nugget that if you could give her one thing?
I think it's that this is for right now. You know, I think that those two words are so powerful with everything, right? Transitions that your kids are going through. If, you know, transitions between you and your relationship to time or work. Um, I think that idea that we have permission to recalibrate on what's working is a gift. And I think it sort of takes the pressure off of right now.
Yeah, I love that. Last question for you. You opened the book talking about holding Bodhi in the recliner and saying that you felt really at peace and you felt this feeling that you hadn't felt in a long time. I'm curious if now, however many years later, if you still feel that peace, if you still find that, is that still within you?
I do think it gave me that superpower. And I think those years, I don't know what it would have been like if I'd made a different decision and hadn't sort of dedicated time to it. But I do think, you know, parenting gives you this like incredible perspective
Yeah.
of what's most important.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, you know, I want this book to be a success, but I think about it all the time that if for some reason it wasn't, you know, if the sales, I would still get to be home with my family and I would have still done an incredible, incredible journey. And like, I would have traded it for the world.
Okay, that just gave me chills. I love that because you're really living what you're saying of like, my identity is not tied to it. Putting it out there and whatever happens, happens. But who you are, like, in your own soul, like it's so much bigger than just this book, just this moment. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. How can the listeners support you? Obviously, everyone, if you're listening, go pre-order the book right now so you can download chapter one. But where can they find you and how else can they support you, Neha? What's the best way?
You can come say hi and follow at Mother Untitled on Instagram or subscribe to the newsletter on motheruntitled.com. And yes, every pre order of that book is a vote for sort of more valid options for women. As you know, I think a lot about our daughters, and I think our daughters and our sons will just have
Yeah.
more options available for work and family.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah. We're going to look back like a decade from now, and this will be like the book that sort of changed the narrative, which is like gives me chills and just so happy and grateful that someone wrote it. So thank you. And thank you for being here. We so appreciate your time.